for joining for today's event, which is the first kind of public event that accompanies Beyond Metaphor, Women and War. And just before I introduce our two speakers, I will say a few words about the exhibition itself, which, as Abby has mentioned, is a group show which includes the work of 5 contemporary artists, Marwa Arsanios, Kader Attia, Katia Kameli, Nadia Makhlouf, and Zineb Sedira, all of whom explore through different media women's experiences during the Algerian War of Independence. And the war, as many of you might know, was fought between 1954 and 62 and ended the long French colonial rule in Algeria. All of the artworks in the exhibition offer a lens through which we can re-examine as well as potentially reimagine the intersections between gender and decolonization. And it is this the relationship that stands at the core of the exhibition and its idea. Generally speaking, histories of decolonization have foregrounded the role of men in challenging colonial rule, as well as in the subsequent building of post-colonial states. And in the rare instances when women are evoked, they very often figure as symbols of a collective and sacrificial struggle against colonialism, which of course reveals very little about how women lived through the war and their distinct experiences. The works shown in the IPEX Art exhibition, as well as in its online version, attend to women's multiple roles during the war as fighters, nurses, community organizers, educators, and civilians during decolonization. They also confront the visual trope of the Algerian woman fighter that has emerged and is quite current, and engage with the broader processes that turn women into symbols of sacrifice, suffering, and national unity. So given the focus of the show, it was immediately clear to us that we would like to invite Natalya Vince, who has researched women's histories in Algeria for over 15 years now. Natalya is a reader in North African Studies at the University of Portsmouth in the south of the UK, and author of a book titled Our Fighting Sisters, Nation, Memory and Gender in Algeria, 1954 to 2012, which was published in 2015. And the publication, which is incredibly well researched and also written in a very accessible way, won the Women's History Network Book Prize in 2016. Last year, she published another book titled The Algerian War, The Algerian Revolution, which offers new perspectives on the histories of the war as well as on its historiographies. Natalya is also co-creator of the ongoing trilingual documentary project titled Generation Independence, A People's History of Algeria in the 1960s and 1970s, which is based on oral history and explores the role of students and graduates in the construction of the post-independence Algerian state. And I also encourage you to go on the website of Generation Independence because it includes some really fascinating documentaries. So following her talk, Natalya will be in conversation with Arthur Asseraf, who is a historian of modern France, North Africa, and the Mediterranean, with particular interests in the history of colonialism and information. He is also lecturer in the history of France and the Francophone world at the University of Cambridge. And in 2019, he published his first book titled Electric News in Colonial Algeria, which won the Middle East Studies Book Prize, and which is really a fascinating read as well. And he is a regular commentator on French and North African news for radio and online media. So I will end the introductions here. Thank you again both for being with us on a Saturday. And I will now hand over to you, Natalya. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tazia, for that introduction, for this invitation, for putting together this wonderful exhibition. Thank you to Abby and to Apex Art for hosting it, and thank you to Arthur for doing the conversation bit. And knowing Arthur, I'm sure he's going to ask me some really difficult questions. I'm going to share some slides, which is always a bit embarrassing and awkward when you're speaking at an art exhibition, because obviously I'm not an artist. These are my PowerPoint slides, which very much are those of a university lecturer. And there's just a few images on them. They're sort of illustrative more than anything else. But just to sort of talk us through sort of some of the key questions really that I'd like to raise with you this evening or at lunchtime, wherever you're joining us from. I'll just close that down there. Okay, so in this talk, I'm interested in exploring how women's participation in the Algerian War of Independence has been talked about and represented, both at the time and subsequently by women themselves, by the Algerian nationalist movement, by the post-independence Algerian state, by feminist movements in Algeria, and by a range of other actors. And the question that I'm particularly interested in is the political and social purposes which the production of a certain set of stories about women's participation in the war serve, and how these stories, which are constructed for political purposes, economic purposes, social purposes, how they intersect with women's lived experiences in wartime. So what do we know about the role of Algerian women in the War of Independence between 1954 and 1962? Some of you already might know a really lot about this, so I apologise, but just some basic sort of, background information on, how many women were involved and what they did. So the figure that we have, the official participation figure, if you like, for how many women participated in the War of Independence between 54 and 62 is 10,949 women. And that's out of a total of 336,784 combatants. That figure comes from a study from 1974, well, a study in the 1980s of files in 1974 in the archives of the Ministry of Mujahideen, so the Ministry of Veterans. And already there's lots and lots of things that we can say about that figure. Firstly, there's a whole political context in which you may or may not be accorded veteran status in post-independence Algeria. But secondly, given the kinds of roles that women play in the War of Independence, generally speaking, not necessarily on the front line of combat, we can also see that those are not necessarily the kinds of roles that are going to be recognised as being worthy of official veteran status after independence. So I think we can quite confidently say that 10,949 women vastly underestimates the huge participation of Algerian women during the War of Independence. Because this is basically guerrilla warfare, and necessarily in guerrilla warfare, you have to have the whole population supporting you in order to try and overcome your adversary. So the three main sort of types of roles that women play are, firstly, and this is the vast majority of women, rural women in logistical support units. So these are women who cook for, who heal the wounds of, who hide sort of rural guerrillas sort of going through the mountains. We also have women in similar sort of logistical support roles in urban areas. This is the vast majority of women. These are by far the less known women, and it's even quite difficult to get images of them. This is an image, I would suspect, that is produced by the French army of some rural women that this soldier has encountered on his patrol. We don't know, if these women are supporting the National Liberation Front or not. We don't know very much about these women at all. We don't know what their names are. And in sort of popular perceptions, this is really sort of the image of the rural women. It's sort of an anonymous mass who supports the liberation struggle, but we know very little about their individual stories. The next group of women are far smaller, but their stories are much better known. So these are women who are actually in rural guerrilla units themselves. And specifically, one of the key roles that women play are as nurses, or they are also sometimes cooks, or they wash clothes or things like that. This is a relatively small number of women. A large number of them are actually women from the city and from towns. They're urban women who, particularly after the student strike of May 1956, they join the rural guerrilla. There's a lot of images produced of them. There's a few examples of those images here. These images produced by the FLN, and we'll talk in a minute about why these images are produced by the FLN. But perhaps even better known, this is our last group of women, and last sort of type of role, if you like, of women during the Algerian War, are those women who are in urban bomb networks, and particularly women who actually plant bombs. And these are the women really whose names we know. So we have a photo here of the arrest of Zora Drif in 1957. So she's sort of a key member of the Algiers bomb network. We have a painting here by Picasso, no less, of Jamil Boupacha in 1961. She's also, she's a liaison agent in the Algiers bomb network, whose arrest and very brutal torture and rape becomes an international scandal. And finally, on the right, perhaps the best known woman of the Algerian War, who is Jamila Bouhirid, who really becomes sort of an icon sort of across the Arab world. She is arrested, tortured, put on trial, condemned to death, and she again becomes sort of a cause célèbre with a campaign for basically her execution not to take place, which takes place, you know, an international campaign, and she actually is not condemned to death. And we're going to come across Jamila Bouhirid again. Now, for the French, having all these women fighting in sort of, you know, the anti-colonial struggle is something of a shock to them. This doesn't correlate with their idea of the Algerian woman, you know, sort of who they see as sort of veiled, cloistered, submissive, not engaged in politics, not really part of the world outside of their home. And initially, when these women here are first arrested, these are the first 3 nurses arrested in the rural guerrilla, the French satirical newspaper, the Canard Enchaîné, reports that they are actually Egyptian. They can't imagine that Algerian women could sort of fulfill these roles. And this also sort of fits the French narrative, in which they say sort of the uprising, the rebellion in Algeria is being sort of fomented by Nasser, and is basically, you know, part of his sort of external troublemaking, rather than, you know, something that has come from Algeria and has come from the colonial context within Algeria. And of course, all of these images, none of these images sort of exist by accident. So what we're seeing here is the production of a dominant iconography, a dominant set of visual tropes, to pick up on Kazia's words. And it's not, you know, very obvious, it's not sort of a random snapshot documentary account. And that's why it's so important to situate these images within their conditions of production, because they are part of the FLN's political struggle. All these images of women fighting alongside men help the FLN on the international stage counter the French narrative that they are just sort of a minority of fanatical men who don't represent the wider population. All of these images help counter the French claim that they're leading a civilizing mission and that they're modernizing Algeria, because actually what the FLN does with these images is they show that actually modernity is achieved through the anti-colonial struggle, through independence, and actually what the French are doing in Algeria is barbaric, and it's particularly barbaric towards women. And that's why those stories of rape and torture committed against women are also part of the FLN's political campaigning internationally, both at the UN, for example, and in individual countries where there are Algerian representatives, which are indeed sort of across the globe, really, sort of by 1960. So if we think about, for example, those images that you can see on the right of the screen there, those are actually produced by an FLN team of cinematographers and photographers who are creating these images on the Tunisian border. These are Algerians, some of them are French, some of them other nationalities as well. If we think about this Picasso painting here, you know, getting Picasso to do a painting is not, you know, or drawing is not nothing. So that, you know, demonstrates the ability of the FLN to actually appeal to sort of, you know, the liberal sort of, you know, Western sympathizers, and how important that political struggle is alongside the fighting. and of course Jamila Bouhirid, and of course we saw that in one of the films that you have as part of your exhibition. You know, she, as I've already said, is an international icon. She gets a film made by her, by sort of, you know, about her, by the iconic Yusuf Shaheen in 1958. So we have this sort of iconography, which is actually really very familiar to us. And I think one of the other things that's quite important to underline is the way in which it's blurred with fictional representations of the war. And something that you will find very frequently is that images of women in the war are sometimes actually taken from a very famous film, very brilliant film, The Battle of Algiers by Gilles Pontecorvo, that was actually made in 1966. And Gilles Pontecorvo, he puts this disclaimer at the start of the film saying, you know, all of this is a film. None of these are actual, you know, images from the war. But nevertheless, these images themselves have become so iconic that actually they're often used, including in documentaries, as sort of, you know, photos from the war. And that has played a really important role in consolidating the image of Algerian women during the war, and in particular in sort of, you know, really pushing in the foreground women who were in the urban bomb network, as opposed to women who played other roles. In particular, it very much sort of overshadows the rural struggle. And that has an interesting effect too, which I'm going to come back to shortly. So what does this iconography sort of not tell us? Well, of course, it doesn't tell us lots of things. It doesn't tell us really what the FLN position is on women. FLN doesn't really have a position on women. There's lots of, you know, different people in the FLN that have lots of different ideas about what role women should play in the struggle. There is a general consensus that it's important to have women supporting this struggle. But whether that is in sort of traditional sort of feminine roles, you know, cooking and cleaning and so on and so forth, or whether it's, you know, bearing arms in combatant roles, you know, living alongside men in the mountain, those are two very different things, and there's very different opinions on those. For, you know, more conservative men within the FLN, the presence of women in public space is a temporary phenomenon. It's necessary because of the struggle, but it's not something that is ever imagined as sort of permanent. And for leftist men, it's probably very important to underline that they're not particularly interested in this question either. Yeah. So, you know, there's this idea that the end of colonial rule will be the end of all forms of oppression. So it's not necessarily seen as important to think through other forms of oppression which might exist, whether they're class-based or gender-based, because, you know, independence is going to fix everything. So there isn't an FLN position on women, even though there is the production of this image that actually, you know, post-independence, Algeria is going to be this sort of, you know, wonderful sort of paradise in which, you know, there's going to be equality of the sexes, that is mainly aimed at a certain liberal sort of Western audience. And there's actually relatively little interest as well in how women themselves relate to these images. We just see pictures of them. What do they think of them? And this one of veiling and unveiling is really sort of epitomizes this problem for me in many ways. So Pontecorvo's sort of representation, he's got this very famous scene, I'm sure many of you have seen it, where women unveil in order to go and plant bombs. That is basically sort of a cut and paste. It's a cinematic reproduction of Frantz Fanon's Algeria Unveiled from 1959, in which he talks about the dynamism of the veil, the fact that, you know, women play on the fact that, you know, they think that veiled women are apolitical, that they're backwards, they're stupid, they wouldn't get involved in politics, and they use veiled women to transport arms and tracts and so on and so forth. And the unveiled women, for the French, according to Fanon, are seen as just automatically pro-French. Yeah, they've modernized, they've taken off the veil, they are willing to accept the benefits of sort of French civilization. And this is what Pontecorvo does on screen. Yeah, he shows these women moving you know, in the very sort of Maoist way, like a fish through water, because they're unveiled, which gives us the impression that these women unveiled to go and plant bombs. But actually, most of the women who planted bombs didn't wear the veil in the first place. So there's quite an interesting sort of distorting effect that takes place because of sort of the symbolic meanings that have been given to these women and to their roles, and of course the way in which they're read through, you know, subsequent lenses and subsequent politics of the veil, and that's sort of read backwards into the context of, you know, 1957. When we go to this photo, this one here, this photo of 3 nurses in the Maquis. So in my research, one of the things I was quite interested in was actually showing women images of themselves and seeing, you know, many years later, I did the interviews in 2005, what they thought of them. So this woman in the sort of not very good quality newspaper photograph, the one on the far right, her name is Fadela Mesli. She was a midwifery student who joined the rural Maquis in 1956. And she talks about the fact that, you know, they knew that these photos were staged. She actively participated in staging these photos because they knew that basically, you know, liberal Westerners liked seeing pictures of unveiled Algerian women carrying guns. Yeah, so they're acting out this image that they know is going to have a certain appeal to sort of a liberal audience to basically win political support for the independence struggle. So they take these photos and then they all get captured, and the roll of film gets captured with them as well. And the French army pass these images on to a magazine called Jour de France, who decided to publish them not to celebrate these women at all, but to point out this scandalous thing that's happened. These women who've received a French education have basically, you know, turned against the French state. They've bitten the hand that feeds them. So these images are published with the headline, "These smiling nurses are killers." And then Fadela Mesli describes that they had quite an unexpected effect in many ways, because she says to me that when, well, I'll quote you, she says, many men joined the Maquis, they joined the rural guerrilla when they saw these photos. They said to themselves, how is it that women can fight and we are like women, in inverted commas, staying at home? And of course, she doesn't necessarily think that fighting is an exclusively sort of masculine endeavor. But she demonstrates that she's very conscious of the fact that she can sort of play on the sort of, you know, gendered stereotypes, play on ideas about masculinity, and play on these in order to sort of, you know, get support for the struggle. And at the same time, she's also the interviewee who said to me that we have 2 struggles to lead, one against colonialism and one against taboos in our own society. And she said the second one was perhaps even more difficult. So the way in which, you know, women interact with these images, I think, is sometimes quite unexpected. And I think sometimes even images where women are seeing, you know, I remember a group of women sort of looking at a photo and they were talking about it amongst themselves, and they were saying, do you remember that day? You know, we were really crying because we've been walking in the mountains for so long, we hadn't had anything to eat. But they're not crying in the photo, they're smiling in the photo. But then that reminiscence was part of a sort of a very sort of joyful event in which they were remembering their time in the rural guerrilla. So I think the different layers of meaning, the different the meaning making sort of shifts over time, and it changes depending on the context as well. And sort of that's something that I was really interested in when I was doing my research. So let's move on to sort of the post-war period now. And of course, historians have long debated the impact of women participating in wars. Does that have an impact or not on the roles that are assigned to them, on how they're being represented? Does it bring about sort of lasting structural changes in the dominant power relations? Does it undermine the patriarchy, and so on and so forth? And I think basically, you know, what most historians would probably say would be that no, yeah, the idea that war suddenly, you know, changes all of the dominant power structures, it's not going to happen. But certainly it opens up spaces for assigned roles and representations to be transgressed. Certainly it was the position of the Algerian state after 1962 that the war was a turning point, and in official texts and in the presidential speeches of Ben Bella and then Boumediene, this is a theme that they actually repeat quite often. They say women have participated in the war, and therefore, as a result of women participating in the war, now, this means that, they can participate more in politics, they can participate more in society, they've proved themselves, and now, let's include them more in sort of public space. But they actually said that quite a lot. It doesn't necessarily mean that they were particularly keen on doing things that might make that easier, like providing childcare or something like that. So it's sort of a rhetorical device. Women participated in the war, they were very brave, they've won all their rights, that functions to not do anything, really, because obviously independence has already solved all the problems. And this kind of also links to sort of the socialist discourse, really, which is at the time, and how that is used. And because, of course, socialism solves all the problems as well. But I think what's quite interesting is the way in which women who participated in the war also use exactly the same discourse. Yeah, so there's a very interesting article that is published in 1963, in which two women, Zora Drif, whose photo you've already seen, and Marim Belmehoub, whose photo is also on there, she's arrested with Fadela Mesli. They basically are asked, does Algeria have a woman problem? And their answer basically is no, Algeria doesn't have a woman problem. Algeria has a problem with education. Algeria has a problem with equal pay. And that actually, if we address these issues, and ideally address them through socialism, then there's no need to talk about a woman problem. So it's quite interesting sort of how that functions as an argument. Why are they making that argument? Well, you could say that, they've been interviewed by a newspaper in a single party state. What else are they going to say? They're going to toe the official line. But what's quite interesting, more interesting, I think, is the fact that they don't want to talk about the woman problem. They don't want to be seen as something sort of separate and apart, and that needs to be dealt with separately. And there is a real reluctance of Algerian women after 1962, particularly that minority of women who did sort of, challenge taboos within society, challenge, the separation of the sexes, which was a very important, rule of social organization. They don't want to be labeled with the person who's going to talk about the woman problem, the woman who's going to lead, the national organization for women. So there's a way in which speaking as a woman is delegitimized because of the fact that you have fought alongside men almost for your right to speak as a neutral citizen. But of course, as we all know, neutral citizenship doesn't really exist, and the neutral is often male. Now, this changes from the late 1970s and early 1980s onwards, and it changes in the context of sort of an increasingly conservative shift in Algerian society, which is embodied in many ways by the introduction of the family code, which introduces a very conservative reading of Islamic law, which is particularly detrimental to sort of women's rights in marriage and divorce, and access to their children after divorce, and so on and so forth. And at this point, this sort of small group of women who were in the urban guerrilla, who were in the rural guerrilla as well, they do start to develop a narrative about their participation. And they do start to speak as women combatants and sort of appropriate that label for themselves. What's quite interesting is the way in which that is framed. They critique the post-war Algerian state and what they perceive to be its failings through a glorification of the war, and sort of sometimes explicitly made but implicit throughout a lot of the arguments that they're making against the family code is that it is anti-nationalist to be sexist. And it's quite interesting to think about how that functions as an argument and what its limitations might be, that the true veteran is a man who respects women. And therefore, if you are not respecting women's rights in the post-independence period, either you're a fake veteran, or you're a fake veteran, basically. So there's this association that's made by these women between being a non-sexist man and being a true veteran. So the key thing to underline, though, is that women who participated in the War of Independence, who I'm going to refer to collectively as the Mujahidat, they're a symbolic resource for all different groups in Algerian society. So it's often said that these women are forgotten in the official narrative. And I don't think that's actually true, because we do find them in museums, we do find them in school textbooks. People do know who some of these women are. They're presented in sort of very selective ways. The vast majority of women are not there, but that is, you know, the case of any sort of national history. It is very selective, but there is a very selective place for these women in the national narrative. And in particular, I would say the state puts even more emphasis on the role of women in the war during the 1990s, during the civil violence, at the point at which the Algerian state is seeking to demonstrate to the rest of the world that they are, you know, the last bulwark in many ways against, you know, violent sort of Islamic fundamentalism. And of course, celebrating the role of women in your liberation struggle is actually a really good way of doing that. So these women absolutely sort of have a place in the Algerian national narrative. They also have a place in a feminist narrative, which is constructed in opposition to that of the state and in opposition to the more conservative elements of Algerian society. The idea that these women basically, you know, they fought two struggles, to quote Fadila Mesli, you know, they fought against colonial rule and they also fought against the patriarchy in their own society. And they're also a symbolic resource for those who contest state power more broadly. So if we think about the Hirak, the popular movement against the political system in Algeria since 2009, not only is the presence of now very elderly female veterans in those demonstrations really celebrated by protesters, but their imagery is really used in those demonstrations as well. And they're seen to represent a kind of revolutionary legitimacy which hasn't been tarnished by the post-independence period in the same way that it has for a lot of the men who took political power. These women can also belong to conservatives. So in 2007, I did some interviews with students at university in Algiers. And I asked them, you know, do you think the Mujahidat are models for women today? And I just wanted to read you two quotes. One of them was, "The revolutionary woman is not like the woman of today, i.e. that of makeup and exhibitionism." And another quote, "There is a big difference between women today and women who participated in the revolution. Women today serve no purpose apart from destroying society, apart from, with the exception of a God-fearing minority." And these women are, of course, as the exhibition shows, a symbolic resource well beyond Algeria. They're a symbolic resource in Palestine, they're a symbolic resource in Egypt. And the really important thing to underline is that even though these women are being used for all different kinds of political purposes, there are some core elements to that story. Yeah? So unity of purpose, one sole hero, the people. No one should, you know, put themselves ahead more than any one person, and that this was a just war. So even though, you know, these women's images is used for very, very different political purposes, there are some core elements that all of those stories share. So invariably, if you're using this story for political ends, you have to simplify it. So I'd like to just sort of round off with a series of questions, really, for us to discuss. So one of the things that feminist movements do in Algeria, if we look at this banner at the bottom of this picture here, is they often position the Mujahideen as part of a long genealogy of Algerian women who challenged societal oppression and expectations. So we can see some of the women here. So we've got Nabila Jahin is one of the women you can see there. She was murdered by Islamist group in the 1990s. Fatma Nsouma, 19th century sort of heroine resistor against the French. Hasiba Ben Bouali from the War of Independence. So there's this construction of this genealogy that then younger women insert themselves into of basically eternal sort of, resistance. And this is very useful politically for lots of different reasons, and not least it enables women to defend themselves against sort of inevitable accusations of sort of westernization, because they can demonstrate there's this long genealogy of women who have fought not only to liberate Algeria, but also to liberate themselves. But then this raises a series of questions. We talked a little bit earlier about in the 1980s, this idea that campaigners against the family code use, that it's sort of fake veterans pushing this, that true nationalists are not sexists. But what about if true nationalists are also sexist? Can you be a good nationalist and a misogynist? So we can see how politically it's very effective to say, actually, in the liberation struggle, men and women fought alongside each other, side by side. And actually, this demonstrates that this is completely possible. And anyone who says otherwise is betraying the values of the revolution. But then at the same time, what conversations does this shut down? How can you challenge the man who's definitely a true nationalist, but also most definitely a misogynist? And then, of course, there's a whole series of broader questions attached to this about sort of the moral economies, if you like, of veteran status. If your cause is legitimized by having these women who participated in the war at your side, what do you do when they're no longer there? And that is a real sort of generational question. What happens to these women's stories when they become a symbolic resource? Is the messiness of lived experience lost? And I think this is something that really came out a lot in my interviews. When people were talking about the war, when women were talking about the war, they talk about it in ways in which you can see this is a very, very messy conflict. Sometimes it's not completely obvious, who the different sides are. If you are a rural population, you could actually quite easily perhaps find yourself on the wrong side of the war. Rural populations don't necessarily appreciate, when they're actually maybe struggling to feed themselves, having a group of rural guerrillas arrive that then want feeding. So there's lots and lots of sort of nuances and grey areas in those stories. And in lots of families, it's quite common in rural families for someone to have someone in their family who's actually in the French army as well. This is not an uncommon thing to happen. But then when women give the symbolic meaning to those stories, it's always very, very clear-cut. It's extremely black and white. Yeah, we fought for independence. This was, a just war, and we are patriots. And then we're patriots that haven't been recognised. So I think what's quite interesting is the way in which women can sustain both the messiness of lived experience when they're recounting their stories, but also a very unambiguous, very black and white moral meaning that they attach to it. And I think there is space to accommodate both of those things sort of side by side. Just want to read you out some quotes from Fatima Bersi, who is from a little village in Kabylia. She's known locally as the leader of the Mujahideen. So this is what she says at one point in the interview. The women who joined the Maquis, they were luckier than us who stayed. They were less exposed. We were defenseless. At any moment, the French army could come, break down the door. The French came, they surrounded us, they made us come out, they smashed the roofs, and then the Mujahideen, they came and they made us rebuild their houses. We were caught between two fires. Yeah, so there we see sort of the grey areas. But then later in the interview, I asked her, I said, did you ever regret participating in the war? And she says, jamais. She says, never. She says it in French. The rest of the interview is in Tamazight. But there are regrets because the action of Algeria was insufficient. We weren't expecting it to turn out like this. There are young people who have no work. They want them to do the army. They call upon young people, but there's no work afterwards. We need to wake up. We need to revolt against injustice even now. Our country is rich, but the wealth is eaten up by those who are there in power. The cost of living is high. The man who has 7 children and doesn't have a job, what is he meant to do? Let them throw the people into the sea, and those who rule can stay. So there we can see sort of the symbolic meaning and the messiness of experience that very much coexist in the interview with the same person. And then the final point that I wanted to make was about silences. And I think this is quite an important question to open up in the context of the Stora report that was published earlier this year in France, which is very much about the importance of talking about the past in order to reconcile. And, you know, this is really sort of the product of you know, many years of the historian Benjamin Stora's work that he's, you know, put in a report for the French president. His first book was published in 1991 called The Gangrene and Forgetting. And this idea that if you don't talk about things, it becomes poisonous, that wounds fester. This sort of quite psychologizing idea about sort of memory and how we deal with the past, that is really influential in shaping how certain topics are talked about. And of course, one of those topics is rape and sexual violence. And I think one of the things that emerged from the interviews that I did is that silence for these women, they don't necessarily consider it to be a bad thing. That actually forgetting can be a good thing, forgetting can be protective. That's something that the ethnographer Camille Lacoste du Jardin found, you know, in the 1960s. She was in the region of Kabylia talking to women who had been raped, and she's like, what did you do? And we're like, well, we tried to make the women abort, and if that didn't work, we just didn't talk about it anymore. Khadija Adel in the Ores Mountains has found sort of quite similar stories. And I think the key questions to think about perhaps here is who is doing the silencing. So if it's about women sort of choosing to sort of maintain composure, that actually the silencing is a way of them of dealing with sort of painful and difficult memories, then that is very different from if that silence is imposed and it's about maintaining social order. But of course, those two things intersect as well. You know, why might you choose silence? Why might you not choose silence? And I think that really comes out in the story of Louisa Ihilariz, who you see in this picture, the top picture there, who became very well known after 2000 when her story of torture and rape in the French army was first of all, you know, across the front page of Le Monde newspaper, and then, you know, has been much sort of written about since. And she has been the woman that's taught the most about sort of, you know, sexual violence and rape, and she's sort of well known for that. And the reception of her story in Algeria has not necessarily been sort of very positive. So other women who had similar experiences to her resent her for it to a certain extent. So the idea, you know, that perhaps they would have appreciated if she hadn't have talked about it. And it's not just because she's talking about a taboo subject, but also because she's putting herself forward, that everyone knows that she is called Louisa Ihilariz. And this sort of goes against this dominant narrative in which no one's meant to put themselves in front of anyone else. There's meant to be sort of only, you know, one sole hero, the people. And this reminds me of an anecdote that Jamila Boupasha told me when this picture of her came to Algiers to be displayed many years later, and she was invited to the opening exhibition, and she was sort of walking around, and a man sort of was next to her, and he said, oh, is that the portrait of Jamila Boupasha? And she said to him, no. She said, that's the portrait of the Algerian woman in the war. And for her, it was a way also of putting distance between, you know, this very well-known story of violence inflicted on her body, and saying, this isn't just about me. I don't necessarily want this to be just about me. And this portrait is actually not of me. So questions about silencing and whether, you know, trauma is universally experienced and responded to in universally experienced and has universal responses, I think are very important ones to think about. So I will stop there to allow time for questions. Sorry, I went over a little bit. And I think sort of, you know, I've been working on this topic sort of for a long time. But one of the things I think when I started out is it's very easy to sort of, you know, not denounce, but be a bit sort of smug and critical of sort of the glorification of the war and of women's wartime role. But I think what I came to the conclusion of is that it's actually more interesting and fruitful to think about what purpose that sort of glorification serves. And if you're a historian, you always think, don't you, that you're going to be, you know, analysing stuff and deconstructing stuff. But over the summer, my daughter had a task in which she had to, you know, research and write about sort of a woman in history. And I found myself pushing her to do something about Fadila Mesli, so the first woman arrested in the war guerrilla. And, you know, my daughter's only 11. So I told her the story of Fadila Mesli, and I told it to her in a very, very simplified and metaphorical way. And I told it to her as a story of two struggles, and a story in which the metaphorical meaning that I hope she would take away from it would be that men who are on your side in one struggle against one form of oppression are not necessarily on your side in the struggle against the patriarchy. And I will finish now.
Hey, I think it's my job to warm people up until they have questions, but please start writing up questions in the chat, and then we will get to them very shortly. And it's kind of nice, actually, if a few of them brew up, and then we might be able to group them depending on how much time we have, because we don't actually have that much time left. So we'll try and be quick. I just wanted to say what a treat this is, and thanks to Katarzyna Walenska for curating this exhibit, which is so rich. I mean, I really encourage anybody who has not yet taken a good look, whether in New York or on the website at the exhibit. It's amazing series of works. And I've been interested in these images of these women and what happens to these women's lives when they get mediatized, right? And what role the media and the images plays in them for a while. And so when I was looking at this the exhibit in more detail yesterday, and I was trying to think of what I was going to ask Natalya, one of the things that struck me is how similar some of these artists' processes were to historians. So a lot of it involves collecting people's stories or reworking stories that are available out there in some kind of mediated format, and then making sense of them either through collage or through some kind of remediation. And so I guess I wanted to start by asking Natalya, well, what is it like to collect these stories? You know, you did so much of this oral history, which is in Our Fighting Sisters, which I strongly recommend reading to anybody who hasn't. It's fantastic work. And what's one of the really outstanding things is the richness of the oral history. And so what was it like kind of collecting these stories? What do people like talking about? What do they not like talking about? And can you kind of recognize bits of your process in the exhibit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's firstly, it's a very humbling experience, right? That someone's sort of accepted to talk to you and to share their story. I mean, the obvious thing sort of from the outset is that story is shaped by you, and that, you know, you play a key role in shaping what they're going to tell you and sort of how they're going to tell you that. So when I did the interviews, I was a lot younger than I was now, which was quite an advantage. I think I was that age of sort of their granddaughters in many cases. And so there was an element in which it was sort of quite pedagogical. They were explaining things to me, almost as if they were sort of talking to their grandchildren, but also at the same time saying that these hadn't not stories that they've told their grandchildren, that their grandchildren are not necessarily that interested. And so that was interesting, you know, for me as well, to think about why people tell some stories to some people and sort of not others. And I know afterwards, sometimes I've been contacted by the children of these women who've said, actually, you know, after you left, we had a really big conversation. My mom told me things that you know, she'd never told me before. I think the other thing sort of about collecting the stories is that I didn't want to get people to talk about just a load of really horrible things that had happened to them. So, you know, some of them, they did talk about sexual violence, but, you know, that wasn't necessarily going to be a question that I would explicitly ask them. It emerged through sort of other questions. And I did talk about it with Louisa Ihilariz because, of course, she is, you know, the most famous, in inverted commas, person for talking about sort of rape and sexual violence. And she also has a training, she trains as a psychologist, so she talks about that through her own training as well. And of course, that's the other thing that is really important that emerges from the oral history interviews, is that all of these people are telling you these stories through everything that has ever happened to them ever since, and also everything that they've ever watched on TV as well. And you can really see that as well. So some women, when they're talking about planting a bomb, what I think they're really doing is they're telling you a scene from the film The Battle of Algiers. Now, is that because The Battle of Algiers is just a really accurate film, or is it because it has played such an important role in shaping sort of dominant representations that actually there's a fusion between, you know, what people have experienced, and that becomes part of their memories as well. And I think that's the most interesting thing that I found, these sort of layers of sort of different experiences and different parts of their lives that come together, you know, when they're talking about sort of specific, you know, moments in the wartime period. It's never, ever just about the war. And perhaps sometimes it's not about the war at all.
So I see that we have some questions popping up in the chat, which is really exciting. I'm just gonna collect a few more. So in the meantime, I guess you're interested in, so there's this distinction between the lived experience of these women during the war, which is very messy, sometimes quite contradictory, and then the way in which they were made into symbols, both at the time in the FLN's kind of, I don't like the word propaganda, but media work internationally, and then since then, right? And it keeps on getting remade and remade and remade. And those things can seem quite separate. But I mean, I think you're interested in overcoming that distinction, right? Between some, as you say, sometimes they combine the two in their story. And I do wonder sometimes if there's been a bit of a tendency to exaggerate the extent to which women were silenced by being made into images. And so I wonder, like, do you encounter, how much can you find the pleasure or the power of being made into an image, of being made into a symbol, of women sort of actively seeking that attention or seeking to control the representation that is made of them and or profit from it in some way?
I mean, I think sort of generally, I would say of the women that I interviewed, none of them likes being made into an image. But I think that's for two reasons. So firstly, because of, you know, the strength of this idea of one sole hero, the people. Yeah, so there's something quite dangerous, really, about becoming sort of an individual icon. Firstly, you know, you're sort of breaking with this dominant narrative that there's one sole hero, the people. You're putting yourself in front of others. You're implying you did more than others. But also because of a sort of very strong, you know, counter-official history narrative in Algeria, that actually the more an individual talks about the war, the less likely it is that you participated in it. So that's also why it's dangerous to become an individual icon, because it's very sort of strongly ingrained, I think, in popular culture that, you know, the old boy is constantly going on about, you know, how he was under fire and how he survived. And he's probably making it up, and that the real veteran is the person that never ever talks about it. So I think there's something that's considered quite dangerous about sort of, you know, becoming an icon in terms of your historical legitimacy. It almost works against your historical legitimacy, unless you're someone like, say, Jamila Bouhirid, who, you know, no one could ever call that into question, right? And there's also something I think about women generally being more reluctant to you know, tell their individual story, or consider that it would be important, or consider that what they did is of interest to the historian. Of course, that's not sort of specific to the Algerian War. And then also, you know, the idea of your picture being out there, or, you know, being on a video somewhere, you know, particularly for older women, is not something that they necessarily sort of feel very comfortable with either. But honestly, I think the most important thing is not necessarily sort of the social context, but it's the political one. It's about the way in which the more you're out there, potentially the more you're almost like, you know, thou dost protest too much. Yeah, the more you talk about it, the less likely it is that it actually happened. And that explains why women are perhaps so reluctant to put themselves forward in terms of their story.
But I do wonder if there's, just as a quick kind of comment, I do wonder if there's a case where people are doing it, not just women, actually, like all of the people involved in the liberation struggle are doing it, but they can't say that that's what they're doing, right? So the FLN has to produce these images in order to succeed internationally, but it cannot admit that these are being done for that purpose, because then it makes it sound fake and it's not an authentic revolutionary struggle. And in a way, I've seen similar dynamics with the Hirak since 2019, where people produce pictures of themselves, you know, in flags in Algiers, and clearly there's a performance, right, of this. But if you say that it's a performance, that you're making these images, then it's accused of being fake, and you're just pretending to be a revolutionary. You're not being revolutionary. So people don't seem to want to admit that they need images of these things, but they do it nevertheless. But I think we have some really, really interesting questions. I'm actually going to take the one by Shaista Chishti first, if you don't mind unmuting yourself, because I wanted to talk about Marc Garanger's images, and I think you have a very, very interesting question about them. Are you with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you so much for letting me ask the question and for a great talk. In a British context, I think mainly kind of air quotes, Western context, we're obviously not really taught too much about colonial histories and resistance and these sorts of things. And it was very much later in my photography life where I started learning a little bit more and looking at images. And to cut a very long story short, Marc Garanger's work is really celebrated. And even today, when I see that work, you know, people talk about how amazing it is. He was a photographer. I mean, we've got this heroic, idealized idea about photographers anyway, but it's like, oh, he was forced to take these pictures. So what he did was he made a body of work where, you know, against the will of the women, as part of the process of identification processes that they were enacting at the time, you know, he was forced into by the French occupiers to make these images of women. And what he did was he turned it into a body of work of resistance, and that's been published. And anyway, I wondered if you are aware of that work and how you feel about it, because as a young photographer who wasn't that well versed in histories, I thought, wow, this is amazing. You know, this photographer is doing great work, making an important narrative be heard. But now when I look at that and I look at other images of, you know, the objectification of people and this idea of agency, especially women, you know, of who basically people who have been othered historically. I look at those images and I think that whenever I see them, it's a reenactment of that violence, because if those women were around today, would they want their images again to be utilized in this way? Because it's usually in a gallery context or a book context. And, you know, Algerian women are not the consumers of these images or this work, for example. And it's highly layered and complex, but I just wondered how you feel, because I think where I sit now on it is that it is a reenactment of violence. And yeah, so over to you, because you've obviously been researching this a lot.
Thank you so much
just
for your question. Oh, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Arthur.
No, just very quick mediation for people who might not know Marc Garanger's images. He was a conscript in the French army who was tasked with taking identity photographs of Algerian women, and in the process they had to be unveiled. And then those photographs, after he stopped being a soldier in the army, were published as kind of art photographs and enjoyed a great deal of popularity. But sorry, Natalya, over to you.
Thanks, Arthur, and thanks, Shaista, for a brilliant question and contextualization of sort of the key issues at stake. I think, you know, you're absolutely right. The issue here is not that he's a non-Algerian, but he's in the French army, and those photos are the product of, you know, forcibly unveiling women in order for their identity photos to be taken, so that, you know, they can be, you know, better kept under the control, and the population can be surveyed better by the French army. And he has had sort of a very long career sort of reinventing them as sort of a body of resistance. I'm going to be cheeky here and pass over to Kazia, because she wrote a whole PhD on this, and she would be a brilliant person to answer this question. Would you mind doing that, Kazia?
Oh, of course. I'm actually just finishing up an article on Marc Garanger's photographs, so it's very fresh in my head. But I think basically the critical writing has been very split. So one kind of one side says that these are photographs of colonial violence. The other one says that these are photographs of colonial, of resistance, of the women's resistance, of their courage. And I think the photographs, you know, they can be of both. They don't have to be exclusively of one or the other. They can be about other things. They can be about, you know, the rural urban divide, about a specific community, about displacement, about different things. But of course, the ways in which Garanger has you know, published these photographs in photo books with a dense auto commentary, they have also pushed to the margins a lot of other really interesting photography that has been done. And there is, for instance, an Algerian photographer, Lasser Mansouri, who also took identity photographs during the war, saying that, you know, he did this because in his view it was better if he was the one behind the camera rather than a French soldier. So I think Garanger's photographs have to also be put in relation to other images that we have. And also, you know, the more exciting question for me is, how do we view these images now? How do we show them in classrooms? You know, do we maybe want to scale them down, to show them in a smaller scale, because they were initially very small identity card sort of images, which were then, you know, put up on the market and were generating profit for Garanger until his death last year. So this would be my response, but perhaps Natalya has also another view.
I am definitely going to bow to your authority in this area, Kazia. I would absolutely agree with what you were saying there.
Kazia, wasn't it the case that Garanger returned to the same region in, I think, the 80s, right? Or something like that, and then re-photographed the same woman, but this time presumably with their consent?
Yes.
Because I got, yes. And so they agreed to being re-photographed.
They agreed to being re-photographed, and their images appeared in Le Monde and then in another, the final photo book that Garanger published, but they are named, which is different from the early photo books, but still their own commentaries are not really included. So it's still Garanger's kind of, you know, individual voice that that structures the whole photo book.
But it does raise, I was just going to say, sort of, it raises questions about about why they agreed to do that, right? So, and I think sometimes the impression that I got, sometimes I would be looking at photos of them that you might actually be considered sort of quite degrading and sort of recounting quite humiliating aspects in their lives, and they're not necessarily reading them like that. They're looking at them, oh look, I was 18 in that picture, and don't I look really young, and I look great. And so they're responding to them sort of in a way that is not how you would respond to it. But of course, you know, we sort of project them and we frame them and we see them based on our own worldview, and they're not necessarily interacting with them in the same way. And that's something that's quite important to bear in mind. But also, you know, what are the conditions of production of that photos? Who does he go to in the village? Who's his fixer to speak to these women to get them to do the photo? And those are all the things that we're not necessarily seeing in these photo books either.
Yeah, which goes back to Shaista's point of, you know, who are these images made for? And the strange thing is, in some of these women thought later that they were made for them, like they were one of the possible audiences. But we have a really interesting question from Jenny, if you want to unmute yourself, about the role of fictional accounts in the discussion of women's roles. And are you here?
Hello. Hi, thank you so much for a really interesting talk and really interesting discussion. I'm kind of just at the beginning of learning about the Algerian War and writing about post-memory at the moment. And so I wanted to ask, in relation to your oral history research, do you think there's things that oral history research can provide that fictional accounts possibly can't, or that fictionalized or fictional accounts provide but oral history does not? And what is kind of the line between those two things?
Thanks so much, Jenny, for your great question. I actually chose my PhD topic on, you know, women who participated in the war and what happened to them after independence, based on fictional accounts, because there wasn't a book written about it. But I'd read a very short, a series of short stories by Esther Jabbar, which was called The Children of the New World, which was so suggestive and fascinating in so many ways about the different things or the different possibilities for different women after independence, and sort of what became of women who participated in the war. And fiction has played such an important role, I think, in the writing of post-independence history generally, just because the fiction writers got there long before the historians did. And, you know, the same for cinema as well. They created an archive, really, where archives, as we might traditionally understand it, are still not necessarily sort of available. So fiction and cinema it's impossible really to study post-independence history if you don't look at fiction and cinema. You're not really going to have a lot of sources to look at, to be honest with you. And I think one of the things that's quite important to underline is actually some of the first accounts that are fictional, but they're about the war, are also done by women who are veterans. So the line between those things is, you know, paper thin, if there is a line at all. So if we think about Asseraf Jabbar, she does participate in a quite peripheral way in the war herself. If we think about her first film, La Nouvelle des Femmes, that's actually, you know, it's about collecting the oral histories of women sort of, you know, in the mountains. If we think about Zor Zirari, she's a veteran of the Algiers bomb network. She goes and does sort of a series of, you know, sort of short stories, film shorts, about the impact on families of sort of participating in the war. She also sort of publishes poems as well. And I think that fiction allows things perhaps to be said that couldn't be said in other forms. And, you know, until we get, you know, to the 1990s, you know, we are in a situation in which all cinematographic and literary production runs through the state. So to a certain extent, there's going to be limits on that, but there's still going to be less limits on that than if you want to, say, publish a history book. So fiction has played sort of a key role in recording these narratives. But of course, then they need to be contextualized within their conditions of production. And I would say that is one criticism that I would make of the way in which Algerian cinema and literature is sometimes used by scholars. Not pointing any fingers, but, you know, cultural studies in an American or a UK university, it's taken as, you know, some kind of ethnographic study of Algeria at this point in time, rather than, you know, a work of fiction that is produced in a particular context and has aesthetic aspects as well. So yeah, I don't know, I think that you would always perhaps look at those things together. And one thing that I would always ask the women that I interviewed was, well, what have you read? Because often that was quite telling. And if they'd read a lot of memoirs of the war, then they would structure their story in a certain way. Whereas women who were perhaps illiterate, and of course 95% of Algerian women are illiterate in 1954, would not necessarily structure their story as a memoir, would structure it because they haven't been exposed to those kinds of frameworks and those kinds of narrative structures. So it was always really important for me to understand what the people I was interviewing, what they had read and what they watched on TV, because you would find traces of all of those things in the way in which they told their story. They would have framed it. That would become part of their own framing.
Right, and we have a final question by Wasila, if you are here, which is on one of the quite disturbing but interesting quotes that came up in one of your interviews.
Thank you. Hello, Natalya. Thank you for your thought-provoking talk. I really like it. And I just, when you read some of your quotes in your interviews, one statement catched my mind. So you said that the interviewed woman said that the women in the revolutionary time, they are different from the ones nowadays. They have no purpose. So this catched my mind. Are these women have another view about the nowadays or the contemporary women living now in Algeria, whether they have continuing to struggle and continue that mission of having their recognition in the society, or they stopped it after the Revolutionary War? What is their position if you have talked further with them about this issue?
Hi, Wasila. Thanks very much for your question. Yeah, so that study, I should underline it, sort of, one quote amongst many. There were a whole range of different views of sort of students about, both women who participated in the war and women sort of in contemporary Algeria. So that student was from a young man who I think would have been about sort of 21, 22 at the time, studying history, I believe. And I think, that it's not a historical analysis of the women who participated in the war, nor is it a sociological analysis of contemporary Algerian society. He's just sort of using a certain image of women in the war as a stick to beat, young Algerian women today. That's really sort of how that's functioning. And of course, what he's doing there is he's got a very sort of simplistic reading of who these women were, because of course they're a hugely sort of diverse group of women across social class, across different regions in Algeria, huge range of sort of different political beliefs, different levels of religiosity, and sort of so on and so forth. And actually, probably if he met someone, this is quite a conservative young man that basically considers that women are a problem that need to be controlled, he would be very, very, very disappointed, because I don't think many of the Mujidet would really sort of fit his image of sort of the pious, well-behaved woman. In fact, many of them were quite the opposite. I'm thinking, for example, of someone like Zor Zerari, who right up until she died, she would sort of sit there smoking like a chimney, which I have no doubt that he would frown upon very, very much. And it was quite well known in the 1960s that if she encountered sexist behaviour in the workplace, would go around slapping her boss. She is not, I don't think, the kind of idealised woman that she's being held up by this student to be. But as I said, this is not an analysis either based in history or sociology, but it functions as a tool of social control, and that's how he's using these women, completely sort of dissociated from and divorced from any kind of sort of analysis of sort of the facts, really.
Okay, I think we've just gone over time. And I'm sure we all have various other places to be. There's a final point that I wanted to ask, but we'll have to discuss it some other time, which is the images of counter-revolutionary women. So I think people confuse often the experience of women in the Algerian War and the women who fought for the FLN, but there was a whole other side women whose images were extensively used by the French army to support the cause of French Algeria. And those images, by contrast, were very important at the time, have disappeared. Nobody's interested in them now because they're very toxic, right? Nobody wants to think about the women who wanted Algeria to stay French. But we'll have to discuss this some other time, which is a sign of a great discussion. Thank you everybody for absolutely fantastic questions, and to Natalya for the talk, and to Abby for running things, and Katarzyna for the exhibit. Sahat and Mir, merci.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon and evening. I've put some links in the chat for more events if you would like to participate and kind of keep the conversation going in a way. But yes, in our kind of final tradition at Apex Art, we really invite everyone to unmute now and get to add your thanks as we close out for today. But thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for your questions.
Thank you so much, Natalya and Arthur, for being with us. It was really a treat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, everyone. This was such a fantastic event. It was good to be with you.
Thanks, Abby. Sorry, I went over time. I got carried away as usual. That was inevitable.
It was a captivated audience too. So thank you so much.
I kept lying and saying I'm nearly finished, and it wasn't actually true. Sorry, Arthur.
Well, wonderful. Have a great evening. And I'll be in touch by email for.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation again. Take care.
Bye.
Enjoy your last evening, Arthur. Bye.
Appreciate it. Bye.